very warm welcome. My name's David Roth and I'm the CEO of the store WPP and Chairman of BAV. And it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to Follow the Sun, 24 hours of broadcasting right across the world, to celebrate the launch of the WPP BAV Best Countries study for 2022, produced in conjunction with the US News and Wharton Business School. It's a pleasure to have you join us for this session. This broadcast is going to travel right across the world, starting in New Zealand and ending 24 hours later in the USA. We have an absolutely packed broadcast today. This year's Best Countries study is our fullest and most comprehensive yet. The attitudes of global business leaders, opinion formers and citizens towards nation strengths has changed dramatically in recent years, never more so than in 2022. And we'll be looking at how those changes in values have impacted overall perceptions of our 85 nations covered in the 2022 study. But perceptions of a country only tell half the story. We'll then visit 24 countries to hear what's happening from WPP experts on the ground, and sometimes how perceptions of a country don't really reflect the situation. Now, our time together promises to be informative, challenging, stimulating, and I hope fun. So let's get started. How a country is viewed around the world is of huge importance, politically, economically, and socially. It has the ability to contribute to both a nation's hard and soft power. The Romans understood this well. SPQR, an abbreviation for Centanus Populosque Romanus, was arguably the first country branding. It was an emblematic, abbreviated phrase referring to the government of the ancient Roman Republic. You only needed to see the emblem, and invaded countries knew exactly what was in store for them. So country branding itself is not new, but measuring it is. Now in our 7th year, the WPP BAV Annual Best Countries Rankings measures global perceptions of countries against a series of characteristics, impressions that have the potential to drive trade, travel and investment. They also directly affect brands. The study was developed by WPP BAV, the Wharton Business School of the University of Pennsylvania, and US News. The ranking is based on a large global survey which asks a range of people about how they perceive different countries against a range of key attributes. Country branding also has a significant impact on corporate and product brands. The words "made in" can instantly lend credibility and trust to a product or brand that a consumer hasn't previously encountered. That could be enough to convince someone to buy, and beyond that, convince them to pay a premium. Likewise, "made in" can prove an instant turn-off if a consumer associates the country of origin with poor safety standards or sees it as being behind the times on social issues or workers' rights. But it's not just a one-way reaction. The perceptions and performance of brands abroad feed back into the development of the country itself. Additionally, willingness for corporates to invest vital FDI is also closely linked to the strength of a country's brand. As local brands and businesses succeed, they generate economic growth as well as lending further positive associations to their country's brand. There's a close relationship between how people feel about a country and their attitudes towards the brand they associate with that country. Strong countries fuel strong brands and vice versa. Think of France and Chanel. Both represent elegance, glamour and prestige. Chanel is intrinsically French, and France is synonymous with Chanel. The same can be said of Italy and Ferrari, or Japan and Sony. In each case, brands and the countries are part of a virtuous circle, a symbiotic relationship. In fact, Germany is a really fine example of this symbiosis in action. Germany has come to represent the qualities of durability and engineering that brands like Bosch, BMW, Audi and Mercedes have shown the world that Germany can deliver. Brands can both shape and be shaped by the perceptions of their country of origins. Japan in the 1970s was known as a cheap manufacturing base, but now respected as a world leader for quality electronics and also technology, thanks largely to brands like Sony and Toyota. South Korea has taken a similar path, with Samsung and Hyundai demonstrating to the entire world what modern South Korea is and is doing, so creating consumer predisposition in international markets that favour other South Korean brands. There's a two-way reaction and a multiplier effect for both. This year's study quantifies the impact. We see that 83% of consumers globally agree that consumer brands play an important role in defining a country's culture. 78% also agree that the country a product is made in impacts my preference to purchase it. Our annual Best Countries ranking was first launched in 2016 at the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, the world's largest gathering of global leaders and heads of industry and influence. It's now in its 7th year, and given how turbulent the past 7 years have been across the globe, enables us to see the impact of the changes. The Best Country ranking incorporates the views of close to 18,000 individual members of the public and business decision makers, surveyed in 85 countries across the world. This year's survey was completed in mid-2022. Collectively, the 85 countries in the 2022 rankings account for about 95% of global gross domestic product per capita and represent 80% of the world's population. Individuals surveyed for Best Countries were asked how closely they associated 73 attributes with a range of countries. These attributes were then grouped into 10 categories that were used to calculate the Best Countries ranking, and more on those attributes later. So come with me as we meet our first guests on our interview stage. Well, I'm very delighted now to be joined by Lord Jim O'Neill, the former Chief Economist of Goldman Sachs and a former government UK Minister and Chairman of Chatham House. Jim, Lord O'Neill, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
President Zelensky has said that the price we have to pay for avoiding a third world war is going to be higher energy bills, increases in the cost of living, and a reduction in living standards. And this comes at a time where we see from our BAV Best Countries study that softer values, sort of like quality of life and social purpose, are much more important in defining a nation's brand. But do you think that public opinion at the moment will pressurise governments to hold their current policies, or do you think they will start to look at alternatives?
Nice, easy question that you start with. I don't know, because it is probably for my generation, never mind the younger generation, the first such issue of this scale and complexity that we've seen. So far, it appears Western nations, who are the prime supporters of Ukraine, of course, have been happy to support the government stance on Ukraine, and superficially accept the cost, which is essentially this enormous cost of living shock. But it remains to be seen how that passes the test of time. So as we're seeing here, the government itself is almost definitely going to have to pay for the cost of this dilemma. I can't help finishing my answer to this very tricky question by also pointing out that if we really want to be serious about climate change and alternative energies, having a permanently higher price for carbon emitting energy forms is probably ultimately the sort of thing that is needed. One would imagine accelerate the desire for alternative energies to become more and more part of everyday life.
Now, you were chairman of the Chatham House, one of the world's leading think tanks. Its mission of a world that is sustainable, secure and prosperous is great. What do you feel, how far are we from realising that goal?
Isn't and hasn't really worked the way it's supposed to do on the tin.
So Jim, what should the priorities of nations be then now?
Yeah, so what should we do about it? You know, I've become linked to a number of things I've been involved in, a big believer in what I broadly call profit with purpose. And we need to have business itself think more about the societal remit of who ultimately they serve. We've lived in an era, and still do, of where the only thing that matters for many, certainly publicly quoted business, is the shareholder. And it's not enough. And private business shouldn't be rewarded if we don't have productivity that goes with these big gains for them. And policymakers need to be more alert to the realities of life rather than just what was in economic textbooks of the 1960s and 70s. And if we don't learn from that, I have a fear that some of the dilemmas that have just blown up dramatically in the past few years out of nowhere could actually get worse.
Now, we started with a hard question, so let's end with an easy one. Lord O'Neill, are you an optimist or a pessimist given the situation we see around the world today?
Right now, I feel a lot more pessimistic than I've done for a long time. However, that said, I've been around the policy area in many different forms for over 40 years, and I've lived through a lot of crises. And the one thing I know for sure is that the crisis you're in, even though it often seems the worst you've ever been through, they come to an end. And one of the big things I've learned is never let a crisis go to waste. And indeed, the making of a business, a leader, or of a country is how they respond to the crisis you are in, because it normally defines how you're going to deal with the future era. So in that sense, there are lots of ways of things that could emerge from all of this mess in a more positive way.
Well, Lord Jim O'Neill, ending on a slightly more positive note than we started, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's been a privilege to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me joining you.
As we travel around the world together in our Follow the Sun broadcast, we'll be hearing news, views and insights from local WPP company colleagues in 24 of the 85 countries covered in the WPP BAV Best Countries study for 2022. Now, before we go to one of those countries, let's remind ourselves of the WPP BAV Best Countries 2022 rankings from the 85th down to the number 1 country. Let's see what the overall findings of Best Countries 2022 are before we go to Ireland for local insights from the WPP team there. And don't forget to download the Best Countries Metaverse experience for even more global insights from the address on your screen. Historically, military power and finance, banks and tanks were the attributes against which we measured a country's power in the world. Not anymore. So what does all this mean? It shows that a nation focused on providing great quality of life for its people, which cares about the rights and equality, and has a focus on entrepreneurship, is seen as having the most powerful nation brand. This reflects a world today and the factors that influence public perceptions and consumer decision-making, and by implication, a nation's political policy making. So let's take a look at those 10 factors and their weights for 2022. Entrepreneurship, 14.2%. Cultural influence, 10.4%. Power, 5%. Heritage, 3.1%. Adventure, 5.5%. Quality of life, 14.5%. Open for business, 9.3%. Social purpose, 13.5%. Agility, 14%. Movers, 10.6%. So it's clearly no longer just tanks and banks that give a country influence around the world. Softer power, which comes about as a result of entrepreneurship and cultural exports, is increasingly making an impact.
Hello and welcome to WPP Ireland, and today we've got a very exciting panel of speakers to talk through the BAV Best Countries study and particularly around the findings for the brand Ireland study. I am delighted to have with us today a number of my own colleagues, Emer McGrath from Group M, who's Research Director there, and a Strategy Director in Wilson Hartlepool and Ogilvy, Gillian Hurley, along with our advertising famous person, shall I say, John Fanning, who is both a lecturer in Smurfit School and indeed an author, is about to launch another one of his great books, The Mandarin, the Magician, and the Mage, coming out tomorrow. So please tune in for the launch of his new book, which will be very exciting and very relevant for today's conversation. So first and foremost, we're going to have a couple of presentations from Emer and Gillian, and then we'll open up to a discussion with John here as well in the room. So Emer, over to you.
Great, thanks JP. Good afternoon everybody. I am going to start with a short introduction and background to the Best Countries study, and then look at some of the results for brand Ireland. So the annual Best Countries study measures global perceptions of countries and how those perceptions drive GDP growth, trade, travel and foreign investment. Importantly, from the business we're in at WPP and myself at Group M, we know that perceptions towards countries directly affect brands from those countries. So how is the data behind the report gathered? Well, the report itself covers 85 countries. There's nearly 18,000 participants surveyed for the research. And not only is the sample then made up of general population and college educated respondents, but importantly, business decision makers are included too. So some might ask then, why does a study like the Best Countries report exist, and why would we rank countries? As I said, it's because there is a close relationship between how people feel about a country and their attitudes towards the brands they associate with that country. They say strong countries fuel strong brands and vice versa. We know Ireland is home to many great brands, some that have been around for a very long time, and new brands that have really great global potential. But the perception of Ireland is linked to how brands from Ireland will perform. So how does Ireland fare in this year's report? This year, Ireland ranks 23rd in the report on best countries. Really, if you consider our size, that's not a bad position. However, we can see from the chart here that we've slowly declined in our ranking since 2016, and that is something that's really worth considering. But looking at it overall doesn't tell us the whole story. For example, business decision makers, so potentially those looking at Ireland from a foreign direct investment perspective, rank Ireland in line with the average in 23rd position. Urban people are more inclined to rank us in a higher position, but where we see some really interesting differences is in ages and generations. We rank much lower than average for younger adults across the world in 30th place. And then we rank slightly higher than average amongst older cohorts. And this is something that Gillian is going to chat about later on. But back to looking then at Ireland from a wider lens, we perform extremely well when we look at consideration for doing business in Ireland. And this is evidenced in numbers released by Ernst & Young as well earlier on this year. Ireland is one of the top 10 FDI destinations in Europe, and we have the highest FDI per head of population within that top 10. Dublin ranks as Europe's 4th most attractive city for investors over the next 3 years. But not only then from a business perspective, we also are attractive for visitors too, with strong levels of consideration for people visiting Ireland for tourism. And thankfully, we've seen numbers improve, albeit not back to pre-pandemic levels. So what is it that contributes to the scores that we see in the Best Countries report? What are our strongest assets as a nation? The Best Countries report ranks nations based on these 10 core dimensions. It's a mix of hard and soft measures, so quite comprehensive in everything that's considered. There are hard measures like power and entrepreneurship, and then softer measures like social purpose and quality of life. But how does Ireland then perform on these core dimensions? Well, it's certainly a mixed ranking. Not surprisingly, we're 52nd on power, that being our influence on the world stage. And for the likes of movers, we rank 62nd. And movers is up-and-coming economies that are dynamic and unique. But where we rank well is on the likes of social purpose. That's being perceived as caring, sustainable, and an equitable society for all. It's Norway and Sweden that are the leading nations when it comes to social purpose. We're perceived as open for business. We've already seen that 64% would consider doing business in Ireland, well ahead of the average. For quality of life, we rank at 16th, meaning we're perceived as treating our citizens well. And on adventure, which is being perceived as attractive for natural beauty and leisure, we know from a visual point of view, Ireland is often marketed with images of green fields and stunning landscapes. Having seen Ireland's ranking now on these core dimensions, it's worth then considering some of the findings from the WPP BAV team when it comes to what actually drives growth for countries, in particular from a GDP point of view. So one of the findings is, interestingly, that soft power, so dimensions that we've spoken about like quality of life and social purpose, rather than hard power, drive GDP for nations. Another soft measure, social purpose, is rising as an influencer of a country's success. Its importance as a driver to GDP has risen from 5th to 4th place in 1 year, and this is a dimension that Ireland ranks 14th globally on. When it comes to cultural influence, that is the #1 driver, not only for tourism, but also for business investment decisions. 85% of business consideration can be explained by cultural influence alone, with tourism 75%. For Ireland, as a smaller nation, global influence tends to be harder for us to achieve, and we see this with lower rankings in the likes of the power dimension that we spoke about earlier on. And finally, and importantly for so many Irish brands, brands impact the perception of a country abroad. They are a marker for what your country stands for. Ireland exports many world-class brands, which no doubt contributes to the perception of Ireland. And through the likes of Enterprise Ireland, we have the infrastructure in place to support and guide Irish companies and brands in exporting, which will hopefully continue to impact positively on Ireland into the future. So I'll hand over to Gillian now.
Super. Thank you, Emer. So as Emer mentioned earlier in the presentation, that actually there is a difference when it comes to demographics. And the largest difference is actually when it comes to over 55 and the 18 to 24-year-olds, where our global ranking falls from 20th position to 30th position. And when we delve further into that, it's actually our ranking in cultural influence that we fall steepest. And to put that really simply, for the 18 and 24-year-olds, they score Ireland a C when it comes to cultural influence, so good with some errors. And when we ask ourselves why this is important, that younger demographic, they're Gen Z. And Gen Z, in terms of numbers, they're 40% of all global consumers. At the moment, in their current age cohort, they have an estimated earnings of $7 trillion. And they're expected to have $33 trillion by 2031. So in summary, we really need to future-proof our country for generations to come. But when we look at culture and we look at cultural influence, it's important to understand what is culture. So it's art, music, lifestyle, sports and fashion. It's our cultural values and ideologies. It's for this audience, it's where they reside. It's how they consume and share ideas and what inspires them. It's about finding a distinct role for Ireland in this audience life, both digitally and in the real world. In terms of the measurements for cultural influence, it looks at how fashionable a country is, how much cultural influence it has in pop culture, is it modern, prestigious, trendy, does it have good entertainment and strong consumer brands. And for us in Ireland, it's not a reach issue. In the last 12 months alone, Brand Ireland has reached over 246 billion people on social media. So that leaves us with the question, is it a relevancy one? We know that in the 18 to 25-year-old globally engaging with social content about Ireland, they're doing that less than the generations that have gone prior to them. We're also skewing more towards men than we are towards a female audience. In terms of our interest base, some of the things that we put out on a global stage, we have horse racing, we have golf, we have boxing. So it's one to consider when we're looking at how we're marketing Ireland abroad. And the most important part that we can start with is our starting points for the generations. So when you look at how Ireland has shown up for the older demographic, the 55 and older, there's all of these different things that have influenced how Ireland is perceived on a global stage. In the 1960s, we had Ireland and America. We then go into the Troubles, Ireland joining the EU, that coming from the ashes with the Celtic Tiger, Irish food and produce on a global stage. And then we did the incredible Good Friday Agreement, which saw the country go even further. But at the same time as that, pop culture, it's really important to look at that. We had Maureen O'Hara in The Quiet Man in the 1950s. We then go into some incredible cultural icons, from Thin Lizzy to Bono to Sinead O'Connor. We absolutely exploded onto Eurovision. We had Riverdance. And what's important about this is where we're positioning and focusing this attention. And a lot of it was very much US focused, GB, and also Europe. What's happened in recent years is the world has become a lot bigger, and there's a lot more countries on the global stage that we have to vie for attention on. We also know with the prevalence of social media, there's a lot more celebrity faces also involved. And when you look at on the right-hand side, that corner, this 2015 to 2022, this is the space where our younger demographic are residing and the areas of cultural influence that they've witnessed in their lifetime. And not only that, they are a generation that's never come before. They're a generation that have been on the internet, and they're digitally native first generation. They don't know a world without online. And they're different in how they embrace culture. They're embracing it on their own terms. It's a lot more deformalized. It's not as stiff. They're inclusive at their core. It's all about authenticity and accessibility. So what is the real Ireland? It's when they travel, it's about self-exploration. So when we think of Ireland and our proposition that we sell towards this younger demographic, what is that creative jumping off point? They look for new voices and inspiration. They look for adventurous pursuits, so everything from wild hobbies to immersive tours to getting on the ground and living like a local. When it comes to Ireland and something we're famed for globally, and St. Patrick's Day being one, we have seen with this younger demographic is actually they're not drinking as much. We know that 20% of Americans of this age group are actually teetotal, and the younger generation are moderating more than ever before. But in saying that, we also have the flip of that coin, where they are looking for a release. And actually, what Ireland offers in terms of a tourism sense, with its nighttime economy and being known and being potentially not being known for clubbing, also plays an impact into that as well. But actually, when you're in Ireland on the ground and at a grassroots level, Irish culture is absolutely thriving. There's amazing creativity. We're proud, we're culturally aware, we're coming up with new ideas. There's sparks of inspiration everywhere, from our incredible food truck culture that's absolutely booming to an increase of 30% in Irish festivals that have happened here, and to our food becoming much more than Irish stew, and having an absolute amazing array of restaurants on the Michelin Guide. And our arts and culture is becoming a lot more intertwined into our urban spaces, from street art to music. So we have an incredible story to tell, and we just need to get that out further on a global stage and start using our new, younger and diverse voices to tell that. So from Barry Keoghan to Mango to Dermot Kennedy to some of our incredible sports stars, and to start pushing those stories out further. And before I hand over, just 3 provocations or so what. So when we look at all of this, what is our Irish proposition? Are we going to have a proposition that is universal across demographics, or do we split it out into a 2-pronged approach? One that fulfills our audience's need for exploration with that younger generation, while also taps into the older generation's desire to explore a more Celtic Ireland. What are the new stories that we're going to tell and celebrate, and through what media, knowing that the world has become so much bigger with social media? And then also, how can we have new diverse faces that we can get to promote Ireland on a global stage and really hand over that torch to the next generation of ambassadors?
Thank you very much, Gillian and Deemer. Thank you so much. And now we just have a quick chat about the findings. John, there are a number of these branding studies out there. What do they help us do as a learning?
I think they help countries in the same way that they would help individual commercial companies. It's important. Your brand image is very important. It's very important to all commercial companies. It's only recently that the concept of the nation brand image has been seen to be a factor. A lot of countries don't like to use the word brand in relation to nation, but if you call it soft power is another way of saying it, or a country's reputation. And the reason why it's so important is exactly the same as in a commercial operation. A country's reputation affects A, how many people are prepared to visit it, B, how many people are prepared to invest in it, how many people want to be seen with goods from that country, and to a whole variety of other factors, from the ability to attract students, which is a major issue, you know, an important industry, if you like, for a lot of countries. And if you're going to attract students, you've also got to attract academics. So do they want to come here? Now, all the country's image affects all of those decisions. So it's absolutely essential that we know what it is and that we're measuring it on a continuous basis, and that we know that its strengths and weaknesses.
Right, John. And looking more specifically at this BAV Best Country study that we've done this year, what's standing out for you about the particular results?
Well, there's 3 points really. The first is that we do quite well. I mean, I wish somebody would come up with an alternative to punching above our weight, but we actually do punch above our weight. So that's number one. Number two is that we have fallen a little bit over the last couple of years, and that's obviously a critical finding. And there's a number of reasons for that. I don't think we should get too worried about it, but at the same time, we should examine where the strengths and weaknesses are. The reason why, and I think it's Gillian touched on it, we are not, the level of sympathy that might have attached to Ireland from an older generation is simply not there now. And she pointed out the Good Friday Agreement means that a lot of that, all that old story about Ireland is not as relevant anymore. I mean, even in the 1970s, when I would have been working on the IDA, we would be worried about some of the atrocities going on in Northern Ireland because of the Troubles. We knew from surveys, a lot of people around the world said that just shows the Irish really want independence and they're very proud of their nationality. So it was actually even a good story from that point of view. But all that story about Ireland seems to be over to some extent. The other point is that, and I think again, Gillian and Emer mentioned it, that other countries are becoming more, the world, we all know the world is becoming more unequal within countries, and this is causing problems all around the world. However, it's becoming more equal between countries. A lot of other countries have joined, have been economically successful enough to be making a huge impact in their own right, and particularly in the Middle East, in the Far East, Southeast Asia, all these areas, all of these countries have become more powerful. Inevitably, that means that other countries are going to drop a little bit, and we're in the shadow of that. Nothing we can do about that. What we need to do is look at where our strengths and weaknesses are, and probably take a more strategic focus on what we want to concentrate on. We are never going to be strong in terms of power. I'm not sure we want to be. That usually means military power. We're not going to be strong. And in terms of movers, I'm not sure. We're not a small country that has suddenly got a lot of oil and become a big mover. So there's certain aspects, certain factors that we're not going to be able to compete with. However, as Gillian has pointed out, there's a lot of areas where we do very well.
Yeah, and just explore that a little bit more. So, John, we've seen things like social purpose becoming a major influence on what we're about. Yeah,
I think there's a phrase in the literature of nation branding over the last 10 years, you often see the phrase getting to Denmark. And that's the objective of an awful lot of countries around the world. How do we get to Denmark? How do we become, how does our rating become as favorable as theirs? And they're seen as the gold standards. And I think one of the reasons is social purpose and quality of life. Those two factors will be much more important in the Danish and in fact, the whole Nordic countries do very well on both of those. And I think that's the areas that we should be, what can we do more in this country to get better ratings for social purpose, particularly, I suspect, in terms of climate change, which is going to become the big social purpose issue of our time. Social purpose and quality of life being, looking after everybody in the country. So the world has taken a move, if you want, and politically leftwards in the last 10 years because of the awfulness of the 2008 recession, which still is filtering through society. So from that point of view, we need to be conscious of what measures can we introduce in this country, which would help us in those areas. I think we also need to take account of the fact that we're not in control of the country. Nobody's in control of the country's image, but there are different bodies in Ireland who are charged with that control. Now, there are some countries in the world where you literally have a brand government department who are charged with brand whatever the country is. South Africa, I think, was one of the first countries to do that after apartheid fell. They decided they needed to do something about this, and they actually set up a specific government department. I think there's about 10 countries in the world who have government departments with the sole charge over their country's image. We don't, because we were one of the first countries in the world, strangely enough, partly out of necessity, in the late 1940s and 50s, we set up the IDA and Portfolio. They were some of the first government agencies of any country in the world to specifically, manage their tourism and their FDI businesses. So we have very experienced agencies there, and there have been various comments. I've seen it in papers. Why don't we have a single unified Irish brand image? The IDA and Fáilte Ireland quite rightly are going to say, look, we've got huge experience in handling our aspect of the image, leave us alone. So
maybe, John, maybe one of the things is that we need to set up some kind of unifying or integrating process. Is that another way of doing this rather than having some hierarchical thing?
I think that's a natural kind of business perspective view, if I might say so. We need a unifying image. I'd have to say, do we? Now, on one level, I agree with you, because it is important that somebody is looking at surveys like this and seeing what initiatives could we make to correct our weaknesses and to accentuate our strengths. Now, somebody should be doing that, I think. Yeah. But I wouldn't take control away in the tourist business or in the FDI business from the IDA and Portfolio Ireland.
It's really maybe just making sure the left hand and the right hand are working.
I think that's a fair point. Yeah. Now, as far as I know, the Department of Foreign Affairs are actually doing that. It hasn't been. I don't think it's been officially announced, but I think they're doing. So somebody is keeping an eye on it, and I think surveys like this will help them to decide on a strategic level: are there any initiatives we need to correct weaknesses, and are there any things we should be doing to strengthen our image? There's one that I think Gillian touched on in the arts. We're not number one across all art forms, and no country is. But in terms of literature, we're particularly strong. More Nobel Prize winners for literature per capita than any other country, and possibly one or two on the way. And that's very strong. Now, the government does support literature in terms with the Arts Council. I suspect we should be even accentuating that, because literature is very important, because you have writers like Colm Tobin regularly in the New York Review of Books, small circulation, vast influence. And areas like that, I think this sort of survey would encourage a department to look at how do we accentuate that.
Not to forget the wonderful work from Sally Rooney and how fantastically received that has been. Sally Rooney is probably
the most successful author in the world over the last 3 or 4 years, translated into 40 different languages. And from a standing start, 3 novels in the space of 3 years. I mean, and plus, of course, the television spin-offs for Conversation with Friends and Normal People. So that's which also gives a very contemporary view. Both those programs give a very contemporary view of Ireland. So again, we're indebted to our writers, probably more than anyone else, for a view of Ireland which is extremely favourable. And that translates into not just tourism, but influence. If you take, where else in the world would you get a scuttery little town, sorry about that, Dorky, or Clifton in the west of Ireland, who can attract big names from around the world? Why do they do it? Partly because of Ireland's, it's a nod to our contribution to world literature on the one level, and it's the fact they like coming here on the other.
Yeah. And John, on that note, thank you very much for your contributions. We look forward to your publication, your new book coming out tomorrow, and the booking launch tomorrow. And to thank Emer and Gillian and my colleagues for the analysis of the study. The BAV Best Country study is available for you. If anyone wants to access it, they can contact either any of us here today or any of my colleagues in WPP. So thank you very much for everybody for joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks, JP.
Well, I'm absolutely thrilled and delighted now to be joined by Dr. Stacey Graham, who is the Global Racial Equity Programs Director at WPP. Stacey, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
This year we see social purpose becoming significantly important, which is a good thing. Why do you think that's so?
I believe in the survey you define social purpose around a few categories such as caring about gender and racial equity, the environment, human rights, and so forth, right? And what we understand about humans is we have an innate desire to have a reason for being. That's another word for purpose. So I'd say if we look at what's happened in the world in the last 2.5, 3 years, that is definitely catapulted into the mainstream. We have all these things coming together that are pinpointing, illustrating how we're failing as a collective.
And do you think that failure as a collective is something that's now being exposed right across the globe?
Absolutely. I would say that even before 2020, we could see it happening, but there's something about a restriction of freedom of movement, right, that makes people sit at home and have nothing else to do but recognize and look into everything that's wrong with the world, if you will. And so I think that it's on people's minds. What does it mean to be in a collective when I'm sitting at home and can't leave my house anymore? What does it mean to really be connected as a society? How do we care for the most vulnerable? And to be really honest, with COVID-19, we didn't do a great job of that. So I think people are asking different questions than they were 2 to 3 years ago.
And I think I found it quite interesting to see the relationship between this movement, I mean, let's call it a movement, coming from the population upwards.
Absolutely. I mean, we also see that some of our health officials do move more politically than we would have expected. But there were people across the world who made the decision to wear a mask even when it was no longer mandated, who stayed at home even when they didn't want to, who got on the streets for probably the largest social movement since 1968, right? It was a global social movement to bring awareness to racial inequality. So I think there's a coming together even in times of divisiveness.
Now, one of the things we've seen in the study is this sort of interrelationship between a country's brand and companies' brands, and we're seeing that interrelationship even more sort of mingled and prevalent this year. So what should companies do to improve their social purpose in relation to how their country is seen?
That is a great question. I think that is something that they're still figuring out. But one thing we know for sure is people aren't simply incentivized by money. That's not enough to keep employees today. Employees want to work somewhere where they feel proud of not only the work that they do, but the things that the company stands for. They want to see their company standing up for social issues that they personally care about.
Stacey, why do you think suddenly companies are finding a political voice as opposed to purely a corporate voice?
I think to an extent, we have been able to observe this shift away. When I studied, there was a clear connection. The business strategy has to align with shareholder value. That's all we care about, maximizing shareholder value. And there was a notion that maximizing shareholder value stood in opposition to a social purpose, if you will. And today, I think people are recognizing that's actually not true. And we increase shareholder value when we can ensure that we have high employee engagement, low turnover, and people care about what they do in the company they work for.
Well, Stacey Graham, that's a fantastic place to stop. This whole topic is something that we are all going to have to understand a lot better, and not just understand it, but also ensure that it's actions as opposed to merely words. But for the moment, Dr. Stacey Graham, the Global Racial Equity Programs Director at WPP, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you.
Hello and a very warm welcome. My name's David Roth and I'm the CEO of the store WPP and Chairman of BAV. Thank you very much indeed for joining me in this very special metaverse experience. exploring the WPP BAV Best Countries 2022 study in conjunction with Wharton Business School and US News. Here we are in the Arrivals Hall, where you'll be able to discover the key insights from this year's study relating to global trends. Here you'll also find exclusive interviews with global experts and analysis of the data. And what a year we've had. There have been a lot of changes from last year. From here you can also go and visit the 85 countries that are ranked in this year's report. Each of those countries have their own individual room where you can explore a wealth of data and insights into each individual country. You might well see some surprises along your journey. And in the departure area, you can discover more about the study itself. Enjoy your trip around the BAV Best Countries 2022 Metaverse. Well, we're almost at the end of our broadcast. A big thanks to everybody from the local WPP companies who've participated, and of course our central team that's put together all of our Follow the Sun 24 hours of broadcasting, to our directors, to Dasgupta, to Paul Reifer, and our producers, Sarah Cousins and Lady Victoria Robinson. Well, all it's left for me, David Roth at WPP, to say thank you very much indeed for joining, and the next broadcast follows shortly on the hour.
if you're done.